postdoc fellow here at Ben Gurion University, affiliated with the center and under the sponsorship of Professor Haynes. And the second session, the sort of general theme is mentality. Our first speaker, well, let me introduce our respondent. We'll just follow the same format as last time, since that seemed to work fine. KEREN HERSHKOVITS is a scholar of early medieval, or early Islam in many aspects, including especially history of medicine. She's currently teaching at the Open University of Israel and is a postdoc emerita of the center. Our first speaker is Lior Yaari Dolev. She's a PhD candidate here in the Department of General History, and affiliated also with the center and under the advisorship of Professor Harvey Ames again. She's working on a dissertation that analyzes polemical treatises and using a methodology from cognitive studies. Her current paper, Religious Conversion as a Mental Journey to an Inner Sacred Place, is a part of her ongoing work in this field.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. First, I want to say that this paper presents a work in progress. So I may not have all the answers, but I will be very happy to hear your question and comments about it. I would like to begin with the world of petals and concepts. The omnipotent one has inspired us with his spirit and led me on to the correct path. First, by moving the white spot from the eyes, and then writing pain the correct soul. Then, the heart of the prophet lay open for us as a secret place where we live, and we applied the mind to the perceiving of their true understanding. This citation is taken from Professor Fonsi's dialogue against the Jews, written sometime around 1109. He was a converted Jew that was baptized in Aragon in the 29th of June 1106, during the feast day of St. Peter. He took the name Petrus. He took the name Petrus after St. Peter, and the name Alfonsi in honor of his royal patron, King of Aragon, Alfonso I. Alfonsi was born in the Andalus, in Islamic Spain, and received the name Moshe. He was well educated in all three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, as well as in secular studies, such as astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. By the year 1116, or perhaps even earlier, Alfonsi traveled to England and then to northern France. He came back to Spain in 1121, and we do not know the year of his death. His dialogue against the Jews, Dialogus contra Judaeus, was composed shortly after his conversion to Christianity. It is a unique and groundbreaking text in the history of Christian anti-Jewish polemics. Alfonsi demonstrated an extensive knowledge of Jewish literature and was the first one who attacked the Talmud and the post-biblical Jewish literature in his polemics. Throughout his argumentation, Alfonsi also used arguments that were drawn from philosophy, theology, astronomy, medicine, and physics. As Leslie said, in the first time, we have all methods and strategies in one single text. The book has 12th chapter. The first 4 contains arguments against Judaism. Chapter 5 attacks Islam. And the other 7th chapter is to defend the true religion, that is Christianity. For this reason, the dialogue has been perceived by scholars as one of the most important Latin anti-Jewish texts of medieval ages, and it influenced other medieval anti-Jewish polemical texts. Even though the dialogue is best known for its polemic qualities, in my talk today, I wish to examine it and the narrative of conversion, analyze it from a cognitive point of view, and discuss the mental journey down the conversion. The fragment that I cited here at the beginning of my talk, I should argue, emphasize this mental journey. Conversion accounts have been extensively studied over the years. Current scholars tend to read them as an instructive narrative that were composed to serve an external influence on the converted writer. Ryan Spieth, for instance, argued that we should treat those texts as a narrative stories and use a multidisciplinary approach, such as literary studies and literary methodology, to investigate those texts. According to Spieth, conversion narratives are part of the religious disputes of the Middle Ages, and they express a polemical intention. I wish to take the theory one step forward and examine the internal motivation of the author, and they are reflected in those personal accounts. In order to do so, I will use methods that are taken from cognitive psychology and linguistic study. More specifically, I wish to look at those accounts not just as a reflection of the external influences of the author, but also as a windows to his inner world and his inner motivation. The use of cognitive psychology, or cognitive historical research, has been gaining some popularity among historians lately. This is an interdisciplinary field that combines empirical cognitive research and interpretive historical research. Those scholars who use methods of cognitive history seek to reach a better understanding of the human mind in past societies, and through it to explain historical events and developments. In order to analyze conversion accounts from historical cognitive perspective, there are some basic assumptions that we must take in mind. The construction of conversion narrative is part of the conversion process and of the convert's way of understanding the transformation of his own sense of living. By writing his personal conversion story, whether true or not, the converted played an active part in understanding the process. As Peter Sperber argued, from a cognitive linguistic point of view, the use of language in creating a conversion narrative increases the inner commitment of the author to the process and of the self-transformation. Moreover, by writing the internal process of conversion, one creates a personal story, and himself and his surroundings. At this point, we should go back to Franz Ponzi and his account of conversion. And once he opened his dialogue with a description of mental spiritual experience. According to him, God has uncovered his eyes and released his soul from the corruption of his former religion. It was then, according to Alfonsi, that he was able to get into the secret place, the prophets. There, the mind could proceed the true understanding of the true religion. It was only then that a person could proceed and further investigate and think of that religion. The heart of the prophets are the mental secretive and secret place. This is where the intellectual understanding, the reason, and the belief join together and reach a full acceptance of the new religion. This is the end of the mental journey of conversion. According to cognitive psychological approach, intellectual conversion is a private and personal process that expresses the investigation of a new personal essence and self-transformation. According to this approach, conversion is a rational choice. Its purpose to create a cognitive balance for the converted to feel disappointed and dissatisfied with his former religion, and therefore turn to seek a new method that are more suited to his ideology. This feeling of cognitive balance is the mental secret place. This is where faith and reason come together to true understanding. In the time I have left, I wish to focus on three aspects of Alfonsi text and analyze them from a cognitive perspective. First, the opening statement of beliefs. Second, the process of writing nothing. And third, the choice to write it as a dialogue. Alfonsi opens his essay with the title. He declares that he believes in Christianity, listing its main principles. There is nothing special or unique in his description, and yet it is a very important part of the text and cognitive process. This opening statement sets the tone and boundaries in the discussion. Everything that comes after that serves the same goal. This is the destination of the journey, but also the beginning of it. As Lior still shown, preparation to a religious experience or journey is as important as the journey. In this case, the preparation are mental. By announcing his belief and by using Christian terminology, Alfonsi creates a farming effect. Farming is a psychological process that creates a more available, creates an association between different contexts and makes it more available to our mind. This increases the placebo effect and the possibility to attain the desired outcome. In the following freestyle, Alfonsi explained why he chose to write this essay. Therefore, I compose this little book so that all may know my intention and hear my arguments, in which I set forth the instruction for the beliefs of all other nations, after which I concluded that Christian law is superior to all others. Scholars tend to read this part as a narrative that serves the polemical purpose of the essay. That is that Alfonsi wrote in order to explain the error of Judaism. But I see it as part of his process of self-persuasion. It seems that Alfonsi wanted to show, mainly to himself, that he was fully aware of his action and that he chose to convert after rational study and after he was convinced that Christianity is the right way and the right and the true religion. And Francie chose to create a literary framework for his dialogue. In this framework, Moshe is presented as a friend of Francie, whom he knew when he was still a Jew. At their meeting, Moshe noticed the happy expression on Francie's face and asked him to reveal the reason why he chose to convert to Christianity. Writing such a literary framework for the conversion story enabled Francie to enter into a different state of mind. The twilight zone between the previous identity as Moshe and the current identity as Peter. According to Peter's proverb, when one writing a story, language shapes the reality and not only describes it. When one converted tells his story, he constructs his self-understanding of his own reality. He does not tell his story as it objectively happens in the past, but rather he reconstructed it as an event that is still happening during the time of writing. Ryan Spears suggested that the figure of Moshe is presented as Alphonse's Jewish alter ego. But I should like to argue that Moshe is actually presents the Jewish that Alphonse still is. To make things clear, because the text represents the current reality of the author or converter, the dialogue Alphonse had with Moshe, that is himself, is a dialogue he is having with his current Jewish self. But why did Alphonse choose to describe his process through a dialogue? According to him, he said he did it for his readers, I thought. I have arranged the entire books as a dialogue so that the reader's mind may more quickly achieve an understanding. The reader's mind or his mind? What is the impact of dialogue on our mind? Understanding it can explain Alphonse's literary decision. Writing and creating a dialogue has been common and well widespread since the classical period. Over the years, the nature of the dialogues has changed. When it comes to medical dialogues, most studies focus on their structure and their purpose-oriented quality. But I am more interested in the cognitive effect of the dialogue on the human mind. When one converts his or her religion, the person required to change is all sets of beliefs. One of the dangers of this process is the return to previous pattern of thinking that were familiar and natural to the person in the past. Our sets of belief develop at a young age and are deeply rooted within our mind. They are influenced by the environment and society in which we grow up. This is our unschooled mind, and according to psychology studies, people tend to return to the unschooled mind and the unschooled way of thinking. This was probably true to a medieval mind as well. Studies made with students at some of the world's best universities emphasize the importance of dialogical methods as a way of changing a common beliefs. In 1982, graduated students from Harvard University were asked why there are 4 seasons every year. It turns out that most of the students answered according to their unschooled mind. The reason, they said, we have 4 seasons every year is because of the Earth's elliptical movement around the Sun and its distance from the Sun. But this is the wrong answer, since it does not explain why during the same time of the year there is summer in the southern part of the Earth and winter in its northern part. The correct answer lies in the angle of the Earth in relation to the ecliptic plane. But people kept returning to the elliptical movement of the Earth because this is the way the unschooled mind is working. This is the way of thinking they received at a very young age. According to cognitive psychologist Richard Cohen, the most effective way to change person's early belief is by exposing those beliefs in a dialogical dialectic environment. By doing so, one can expose these sets of beliefs, face them, and gradually change them. In Alfonsi's dialogue, Moshe, the Jew, represents the early belief system that Alfonsi holds, his unschooled way of thinking. The writing of the dialogue enabled Alfonsi to expose his former beliefs in a controlled environment and deal with it in a well-thought and well-constructed way. To conclude, throughout this paper, I tried to demonstrate that one should read Alfonsi's text as part of his conversion process, and not as merely as a retrospective description of his life. In fact, the construction of the text at the time of its writing is part of the construction of Pedro Alfonsi's self-understanding of the process of his own conversion. Moshe does not try to pursue Alfonsi to return to Judaism, but rather he serves as an imaginary audience for Alfonsi's declaration or faith and his arguments. The dialogue between the two demonstrates the absolute superiority of Christianity over Judaism, but it does not, just for polemical purposes, to prove Judaism wrong. The cognitive points of view allow us to see Alfonsi's inner journey to the true belief where faith and reason comes together in the holy mental place of the mind. Thank you.
Questions for Lior? Thank you very much.
Where are you?
You want to go back there?
Hey, no, I just wanted to know. Yeah.
For
It's fine.
Thank you very much for that. And he is such a puzzle, Petros Alfonsi. So do I understand correctly that you are reading the text to see how his own mind is developing as the process of his conversion?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my first question then is, what do you do with book 5, where he dwells on Islam? Because that's my first question.
I think that's part of his cognitive process, because he was well taught in all 3 religions, and they are all in his mind. He needs to make the whole process with all full understanding. So he has to use all his knowledge.
Right.
This is why he needs all the 3 religions
Right.
and all his methods.
Okay. And then something that I don't know the answer to this one, so I'm curious what you think. So you gave that first quote, which I've also looked at, and that spot in the eye. And what I wonder is, where does grace come into all of this? So Alfonsi, of course, uses reason all the time, and ratio. And in fact, my argument with Resnick's translation is that very often ratio he translates with argument in English, whereas it's clearly ratio, not argument at all. But grace, where does grace come into it? Because in that quote, it is something that God does to him. God does start him on this path. And it's that something that makes it possible for him, in Alfonsi's words, to go through this whole process using his ratio to come to his conclusions. How do you deal with that? I don't know the answer.
Now, it's a good question. I actually had to think about it, and it's a good point to think for maybe the river. I don't know.
No, when you know the answer, tell me. Yeah,
I definitely don't think about it.
Trigger. You need a trigger.
You need a trigger, but then what do we do with the unbelieving Jew at the end? I mean, there are real problems there, because my own reading of the text is that, and it fits very much the way he talks about the Jews as Christ killers, and then it's deliberate Christ killer, and then at the very end, his persona, I mean, I see him very much as creator with his two personae. His persona, Moise or Moses or Moshe, whatever you want to call him, of course remains, of course he remains. There's something, where does that disbelief come from? Lack of trigger? When there's so much around that can do the triggering? I don't know the answer. I really don't know the answer.
Once again, it's really something to
Speak to the
think
mic.
about.
Lior.
No, but you talked about it as the book as not being the end of the process, but as part of the process. So if the book is part of the process, and you still have in the cognitive sense, you're still, even though he's written the book, he's still not. It's not all worked out very nicely in his mind. And so having a disbelieving Jew at the end is not.
Possibly.
Further questions at this point?
Maybe after comments.
Maybe after comments. Thank you very much. Our second paper is also going to take, or is going to make use of cognitive methodology, so this could be an interesting connection. Ovsepyan is a doctoral student at the University of Oxford, writing on cognitive approaches to unbelief and secularization. Prior to coming to Oxford, she was a graduate student at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, and spent 2 years in the US as a Fulbright scholar. Mari is passionate about engaging with idea makers and idea lovers, creating spaces for honest and meaningful conversations, and building communities that are thinking together and living together differently. Her paper is called Sacred Spaces Are Never Empty, Cognitive Science of Religion and Migration of the Holy.
Wonderful. Greetings, everyone. It is a real privilege to be here, and a real joy as well. Thank you for a generous introduction. I always joke that after such generous introductions, I'm almost looking forward to hearing myself speak. Give me just 1 second. We're trying to battle the technology because my notes are on one laptop and apparently are not showing up on the other one for some reason. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to present from a slightly different perspective today because my background is in cognitive science, and I came into this doctorate in Oxford from the Division of Sciences, Science and Religion, where I get to sort of play with both areas and explore the ideas that we're exploring here today from these two really fun perspectives. But also I'm coming originally from Russia, so I kind of bring that in as well, and I'm coming from a multi-faith family. So bringing that in as well, and kind of a lot of these textured spaces that I'm exploring, and kind of all these different journeys coming together. In Russia, there is a saying, any Russian speakers in the room right now? Anyone who speaks or understands Russian? So if I say, "Свято место пусто не бывает," you know what I mean? Sacred spaces are never empty. And this is why I chose this as a title for this presentation. Essentially, it means if religion leaves one space, it migrates into another. There is always something of that religious nature that we find in all these different spaces. And what I want to explore today as someone coming from cognitive background is religious cognition and non-religious cognition, as you'll see in a moment, but also what does that mean for our body, and can we talk about our bodies as the sacred spaces that are never empty. So here's some of the questions we're going to be exploring. As the intro, I thought I would show you one of my absolute favorite exhibits from the museum in Oxford. It is what is called the witch bottle. You can see it actually right now. It's on show. It was on show actually, not anymore, at the Ashmolean Museum, but before that was at Pitt Rivers. And next to it, there's a little note that says, "Be careful, they say there be a witch in it, and if you open this bottle, there'll be a peck of trouble." Nobody ever opened it, so we don't really know. There's no way to test. But the question I'm asking is, why is it that, in the 16th century England, for instance, these bottles were so popular, and you could find them absolutely anywhere, and beliefs in gods, spirits, demons. It was just an absolutely natural thing, whereas today, as Charles Taylor, whom I mentioned in a little bit later in our presentation, says it's just one option among many in the West. What is going on there? So my doctoral research is actually focusing on the nuns, and every time I say that, people think that that's who I study, which is not exactly the case. My nuns are more like this. The N-O-N-E-S, the non-religious. And it is a lot of fun. I'm trying to juggle my presentation on two laptops here. So the 2015 Pew Forum report on global religious identity showed that the nuns, or the religiously unaffiliated ones, actually comprise the third largest religious group in the world. That is 1.1 billion people, which is 16% of the world population. That's enormous, right? That's huge numbers we're talking about. At the same time, the subgroup within the nuns, the non-religious, of spiritual but non-religious keeps growing as well. So what is that about? So essentially the question, the big umbrella question I'm asking in my research is, so who are these nuns and what is it that they do not believe, right? What are some of these things? And one of the assumptions I'm coming from is kind of historical assumption that probably most of us would share in the room, kind of scientific approach to religion that says religion is a trans-historical, trans-cultural phenomenon. There's never been a culture that has not shown some signs of religion, and here we talk about sort of the evolutionary roots of it. We talk about 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, where we already see the burial of the dead, which includes different ritual aspects of that. Again, beautiful educated audience in the room knows all of these aspects, and of course also signs of worship 30,000 years ago, kind of exploring the cave paintings, which seem to kind of indicate some levels of spiritual experience, at least. So I am coming from cognitive science and religion background, where I look at two evolutionary approaches, the adaptationist and byproduct theories. So adaptation essentially just says religion evolved as an adaptation for survival benefits. Byproduct is a bit more interesting. So byproduct theory is also called spandrel theory. Any architects by any chance in the room? Probably not, I would be surprised. But a spandrel is essentially what I'm showing you here right now on this slide. It's the space that is created between the arches, that normally empty space, that is just a byproduct of the architectural sort of, technologies, so to say. The interesting thing is, most architects, most artists would fill that space with something, right? In Oxford, we put crests in there. Kind of every time, every college puts crests in that space, or you see this gorgeous sort of figure there. Probably, what is that? Would that be Baroque? I'm not sure. But that is called a spandrel. And so an evolutionary approach to religion, spandrelist theory is essentially theories that are saying religion did not evolve as an adaptation in itself. It is a byproduct of other adaptations, right? Are you still with me? Yeah? Okay, great. So what kind of adaptations are we talking about? What kind of byproducts are we talking about here? Well, within cognitive science of religion, which has come out of the general cognitive science turn in the 50s and 60s, it kind of came with the same sort of movement that happened in linguistics, with Noam Chomsky saying that children acquire language from those kind of deeper inner structures. And so Thomas E. Lawson, one of the fathers of cognitive science of religion in the 60s, suggested that perhaps religion is something like, more like a language, and it also kind of develops in natural ways. And children, perhaps, we're all sort of wired for religion in a way. Okay, I know everyone will want to talk about what do I mean by religion now, but that is the tricky question that I want to raise in the whole conversation. So what we're going to do now is quickly run through some of these adaptations, some of these cognitive modules that come together and give us the sort of byproduct, so to say, of religion on the other side. One of them is theory of mind module. Theory of mind is essentially ability to understand other people's mental states. Other people have mental states, desires, thoughts different from others. This is just a kind of illustration of a quick experiment. If I ask you what's in this box, you all would say Smarties. If I open the box in front of you and pour the contents on the table, and you suddenly realize it's not Smarties but buttons, because I'm a cheeky Russian and I'm tricking everyone into believing things that are not true. Yeah, that's right. That's what everyone thinks these days. Sorry, staying away from political comments. So imagine a friend of yours who hasn't been in the room comes into the room now and doesn't know what has happened. And I show them the box and say, what do you think is in the box? What would your friend say? Smarties, exactly, because all of you have well-developed theory of mind, ability to understand false beliefs, which means you know that whatever is in your mind is not in their mind. Whatever is in their mind is hidden from you as well. Some psychologists actually say that that ability actually develops around the age of 3 and 4 years for 3 or 4-year-olds. So before the age of 4, oftentimes you will not see that ability. And some psychologists call it fall from mental heaven, because it's kind of the ability to lie and pretend. It develops around the same time. Little children, if you play hide and seek with a 2-year-old, you say hide. Because if I don't see you, you don't see me, okay? That kind of aspect of that. And so, psychologist Paul Bloom, actually from Brown, he says that positing invisible minds inside the heads of other people is essentially one step away from positing disembodied minds, okay? So it's kind of just, he suggests, one step away from them thinking of just these invisible divine minds out there. And that is just one step away from then seeing faces in the clouds, hearing voices in the wind, and kind of that's where our mind starts accommodating all these things, and that's when it becomes a byproduct, okay? And once it becomes a byproduct here, we end up here with hyperactive agency detection device, which is essentially a hypothesis that supplements theory of mind ideas and says that we potentially have a cognitive device that allows us to detect possible agents out there in the world. Again, evolutionary adaptation that keeps us alive, because if you're walking through the woods as an early human being in early history of evolution and you hear sound behind your back, it's much better for you to mistake a boulder for a bear than a bear for a boulder, right? That kind of increases your chances of survival drastically. And so, but then as that becomes hyperactive, you start seeing the face of Jesus in the toast and so on and so forth. So that's kind of another aspect of that byproduct. All of that is then supplemented by MCI, minimally counterintuitive concepts, which says you just need some concepts that are just a little bit counterintuitive for them to spread around, because a mouse that wears pants or trousers, as they say in Oxford, and dances is a bit too much, so we don't worship Mickey Mouse. But say everything that looks like a human but is not human and lives on Mount Olymp and, can maybe fly or has magical shoes that can fly, I'm talking about Apollo, right? Then that becomes some kind of divine figure that is just enough counterintuitive for us to remember and spread that story, but not too much. So I'm just kind of quickly laying the ground. Will somebody tell me when I have 5 minutes left, please? because I'm lost now between the two time zones as well. Great. And so now all of that is then going into the implicit versus explicit beliefs, and that is the most interesting part for what I'm going to talk about next. It is kind of the question, those of you who read Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Kahneman, kind of two ways of thinking, right? Something just happens explicitly, something happens implicitly. Some of those beliefs we're just not even aware of. And it's really interesting because some of those beliefs are just pre-reflective. And what we realize now through all of this research in cognitive science and religion is that we all have implicit beliefs, whether we're believers or not, so to say. Atheists also have implicit beliefs that altogether kind of contribute to what we understand as natural religion. So Deborah Kellerman does a lot of research and study of atheists, particularly in Oxford, actually, people like Richard Dawkins, and under time pressure, tests are given to kind of rate sentences like trees produce oxygen so that animals could breathe. And famous biologists at Oxford, professors with 60 years of professorship behind them, say yes, because it is intuitive for us to think teleologically. And kind of all these aspects then come together, kind of part of religious thinking. Now, what is really interesting is that if humans have a tendency to have these certain implicit beliefs, what is unbelief, right? How do I understand a belief? Some have argued that maybe it's the result of cognitively costly, effortful suppression of these implicit beliefs that leads us to non-religion, atheism, or is something else going on? Now, within cognitive science or religion, there's this paper that I think is really interesting because obviously I cannot bring all of the research in, but I'll just focus on this one paper because essentially it describes 4 distinct pathways towards non-religion and unbelief that most cognitive scientists of religion picked up on and developed further, but essentially it's just these 4 pathways, whether they're named or not, that you see everywhere. So one would be mind-blind atheism, apatheism, credulous atheism, and analytic atheism. And they're all very, very interesting because essentially all of them, as you will see in a moment, are a reiteration of good old Weberian secularization thesis and have a set of implicit assumptions that I think are very unhelpful. So mind-blind atheism is essentially a very cognitive approach that says it arises out of intuitive difficulties in understanding agents, which we already talked about, right? That kind of detecting agency out there in the world. So people on autism spectrum, for instance, because they have trouble with theory of mind module, would essentially, according to the claims, have same problems, which more subtle research right now is actually showing that this is not the case, so it's already problematic on many levels. Second one, apatheism, kind of talks about things like awareness of death, suffering, uncertainty, loss of control, and so on and so forth, as things contributing and intensifying religious experience. So again, kind of talking about us in the West having lost sort of that sense of, religious awareness, or however you call it, but then someone in New York walking in the middle of the night through the Central Park immediately starts sensing presence, right, in the dark behind their back. And kind of that essentially saying that sense of insecurity brings it all back again. So in countries with more secure sort of stable environments, there will be more apatheism, so to say. And credulous atheism, so it comes from creds, which is credibility, enhancing displays of religious belief. So essentially, if you're raised in a family where there are these displays of religious belief, you're more inclined to be a believer. If not, then not. So that is another pathway. And analytic atheism, which is very much about that kind of cognitive, intentional cognitive suppression, because you're educated, so to say. Now, all that is very interesting because obviously all of that is focusing on belief and belief alone, right? Just the cogito, just the mental aspect, just in your head. So we're talking about, again, this sort of hermeneutical project of religion being all in your head, which we had a wonderful conversation with Anna on the way, on the bus from Oxford, like how annoyed we both are about sort of this type of defining religion. But also, if you look at it, it's actually pretty interesting how much all of this literally repeats all of the pathways of secularization, traditional secularization thesis that we know about. Of course, Weber, with his sort of being educated out of belief, classic sort of industrialization and lifting all of that. Durkheim with sort of isolationism, and once the societal connections break, then we end up again sort of all over the place, which is apatheism eventually. And of course, Karl Marx and apatheism with, again, kind of connecting perfect society that would eliminate need for religion which we can see in the incredulous atheism as well. So essentially we're left with just one pathway that is essentially cognitive science or religion pathway, the mind-blind atheism, but as I said, it's already dubious from research perspective, kind of scientific perspective, so maybe not that helpful either. Still with me? Okay, great. 5 minutes. Now what do we do? I think some of the post-secular scholarship, particularly the work of Charles Taylor, particularly A Secular Age, this wonderful weighty tome that he wrote, is quite interesting because what it does a lot, but what it does in particular that I find interesting, it rejects the binaries, it rejects reductionism. And it talks about, you know, the binaries of immanence and transcendence, absence versus presence of belief, and of course mind and body that need to be challenged. It talks about subtraction stories, right, and social imaginaries. And social imaginaries essentially the prism through which we see and encounter the world. And these social imaginaries, they're not just in our heads, they're in our bodies as well. So we talk about sort of the affective component of meaning making, and that affective component essentially comes through the imaginary that we use. And Taylor talks about the concept of mind being the imaginary that we use, that eventually contributes to our experience of the world through the porous or the buffered self, right? So the porous self is the self that is open to experience and kind of multiple ways of interpreting the experience. The buffered self is the self that has shut down, essentially, and just cannot connect, cannot experience. And again, we talk about atomistic self in the West, right? The kind of more West you go, the more atomistic it gets, and that kind of shut down buffered self is part of it. And of course, we're at subtraction stories. Subtraction stories, again, sort of talking about secularism as just the reduction, a mere reduction in belief. Which again, why are we so focused on belief? Well, long history, sort of Talal Assad talking about, you know, secularism being the brainchild of Protestantism, and again, kind of mental focus, Saba Mahmoud, and her hermeneutical project talking about religion being just about mind and belief and how wrong that is. And I love what Saba Mahmoud talks about, skesis, right? Kind of, again, going and researching religious experiences women had in Egypt, and kind of religion for women, that their experience of that, talking about attachments, that we all have our attachments, and that religion is in the space of those attachments. So what I propose is I look at those as kind of to critique the view from nowhere, saying that in science we all have all sorts of presuppositions we also sneakily bring into our research. In cognitive science that is very Cartesian. Cognitive science and religion is still haunted by Cartesian dualism, very much in the Q&A time. If you're interested, we can talk a little bit more about that, but just don't have time to focus on it too much. But how do we sort of battle that mind-body separation? By bringing back the feeling mind, right? The feeling brain, the challenge to the weird science, and weird is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, which is all the societies where psychology is kind of done today. So we cannot go and do our research with American undergraduates exclusively and then make our statements about what religion is or isn't in the world, you know, globally, because it just doesn't work this way. Tyner Luhrmann, amazing, incredible cognitive anthropologist from Stanford University, is doing fantastic research challenging all of this, where she talks about 6 different types of theory of mind. Remember, again, I mentioned the theory of mind module. She says that is just the Euro-American modern secular theory of mind. One type. There's 6 more. And these 6 more ways of, again, experiencing our minds, thinking about minds, perspectives is just one of them, where, you know, you kind of, again, I have a lot of very, very educated, brilliant friends from Uganda and Nigeria who are doing PhDs in Oxford. At the same time, over coffee, they would tell me, Marie, have you ever seen a witch turn a man into a tree? And I have no reasons to sort of like dismiss their experience completely, but at the same time, my Western, Euro-American, even though I'm Russian, secular, you know, theory of mind immediately goes into explaining it away and thinking like, oh, do you mean like their arms grew stiff, or do you mean their skin got some sort of disease, or like, what are you talking about? Like, so I cannot even comprehend the kind of experience we're talking about, whereas Tyner Luhrmann, as a cognitive anthropologist, says, no, the experience of your mind can actually lead you to experience the world very, very differently. And so, kind of again, talking about our religious experiences, I think this is the most interesting, productive space for research right now, is what is an religious experience? It is something Stephen Bullivant does right now, where again, he talks about denying the banishing the boundary between immanence and transcendence, and talking about spectrum, you know, of different small to large transcendences that we experience in the world. So that becomes the space of that migration of the holy that I started with, kind of post-secular transcendence, embodied transcendence. That is probably a more helpful language that we need to explore. And as I am wrapping up here, just wanted to talk about this concept that against Stephen Bollemand and William Kavanagh talk about when they talk about shrinking transcendence and exploding religion. Saying again that as secularization should not be viewed as the denial or the sort of reduction, but as the change in location of religion in society. And that's where perhaps again looking not just at our minds as the locus of religion, but looking at our bodies, and from embodied cognitive science of religion, which is for cognition, which is embodied and brain embedded in culture. So it's kind of the spaces between us, that's where it happens. That is the space to explore, that is the space to look at. So my challenge to kind of cognitive approaches to non-religion would be to stop not defining non-religion, but actually like focus on little bits and pieces of things that we haven't explored yet, and our bodies would be one. And to start digging from there and looking at it from a completely different perspective. Do I have 10 more seconds? Sure. In the 10 more seconds, I'm going to finish by reading you a poem from wonderful poet Philip Larkin, because this is one of the former, what used to be a church in Oxford and Jericho area where I live. Today it's a bar called Freud, very interesting. But every time I walk past, I literally, every single time, think of this poem by Philip Larkin. He starts, it's called The Church Going, and he starts the poem by saying, kind of asking the question, what is going on, right? Why do churches turn into pubs and bars and, you know, all sorts of things? And will there be a time when this disbelief itself will disappear? So this is what he says. So what remains when this belief has gone? Grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky. A shape less recognizable each week, a purpose more obscure. I wonder who will be the last, the very last, to seek this place for what it was. And the last few lines of this poem are these, actually. He says, a serious house, talking about the church, on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized, robed as destinies. And that much never can be obsolete. So Larkin points us back to the affective, the bodily, the physical, the present, and the needs that we all experience. It reminds me of Alain de Botton, very well-known Oxford-based, now London-based atheist, and founder of the School of Life, who was asked this question, what comes after religion? And this is his answer, and this is what I'm going to finish with. What comes after religion? We may no longer believe, but the needs and longings that made us make up these religious stories go on. We're lonely and violent. We long for beauty, wisdom, and purpose. We want to live for something more than just ourselves. The choice isn't between religion and the secular world as it is now. The challenge is to learn from religions so we can fill the secular world with replacements for things we long for. This is our challenge, and it begins here. I disagree with Alain de Botton on many different levels, but I do think that this is a challenge for us as well, and it also begins here. So I would be very keen to hear your thoughts and discuss this paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marty. Questions?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, especially following your quotation of Tommy Lurman, what do you make of the argument that the development of technologies, new technologies, change our capacity for religious experience? So one of her arguments that, in California that she studied, right, some of the congregations, that people can hear the voices of God or spirits much more easily because they're used to being hooked up to phones where what they see and what they hear don't correspond. And if so, can cell phones have religious experiences?
That's a great question. Thank you. I love Tanya Lerman's research. I think it's just really interesting because she's not personally coming from religious background, but I think she's an example of just one of the best examples of cognitive anthropologist ethnographer who just goes and spends time. All of that research she did was in California and Vineyard Church, kind of looking at the experiences within Pentecostal church and kind of what is going on. Are people actually hearing the voice of God, or is it psychosis, or what's going on? And now she has expanded all of this into her work in India and somewhere in Africa. I don't remember which country last time we chatted. I don't remember. So she's kind of trying to compare it now and think about that. So on the one hand, yes, I think I agree there is something about that bodily and physical that is a cue for the experience. It doesn't make the experience any less. I'm not a theologian really, so I'm not making any theological claims here. I'm not saying that just because something can trigger a certain experience, it is less so. I don't think it's about explaining things away. I want to hold a space where the experience matters, but we can still understand the sources of the experience and the ways that experience is shaped. And I personally, theologically, I don't have a commitment that says understanding something makes it less real. Now, when you said, do cell phones have religious experience? Cell phones probably don't, but like they can trigger for us, perhaps, a more open space, a body that is more, perhaps, able, but at the same time a body that is also less able to treat it as normal. Experiencing something outside, just hearing a voice outside of some sort of physical source. And this is what she does comparing, Tanya Lerman does comparing the schizophrenic actually experiences of hearing voices in India and in the United States. And she plays the same tapes and then interviews people, with same diagnosis essentially. And what is really interesting is that in the United States, all the voices people hear are negative voices because there is that kind of almost like, again, that secular Eurocentric theory of mind says, oh no, hearing a voice is bad, hearing a voice is wrong, or buffer it. Whereas in India, it's the same voices, but people learn to live with them, and they become nice voices, and they become friendly voices, and they become essentially a voice that you sort of like chat to on a daily basis and kind of like helps you live your life. They're not negative, they're not the voices that are telling you you're disgusting, you're quoting like, go kill yourself, etc., which is kind of coming from, I don't know if she has published that yet, but it's kind of her work in progress right now. So, I don't know, I think that is a very interesting, productive space to have a conversation and bring that back into the body. Thank you for your question. Stephen? No? Unless there's someone else.
Yeah, it's done. Okay, so thank you. And then, this is probably the fourth or fifth time I've heard you talk on related topics, so I apologize if this is more complicated or more developed. But so is the main point of your paper that the primary models and lenses through which we view things are relatively cognitive, have ignored so far experiences of affect and embodiment, which have been alluded to at least in more recent studies of secularization,
Yeah.
Mahmoud and others. I wonder if you can still go further, insofar as it seems like, again, it's still a common, one another underlying hunch in all of these things is to find some way to explain how every experience is simply one particular aspect of a more universally shared human experience.
Mm-hmm.
And what are the set of assumptions that go with that,
Mm-hmm.
that allow us to sort of say, well, look, at the end of the day, it's still, that's another level of assumption. And I wonder who is that serving? What is the intellectual history of that?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's an excellent question. I would say, I am interested in that. I'm not entirely sure if this is going to make it into my thesis, but I'm exploring that right now with continually looking into affect theories, and particularly mozzarella, and I know we read that paper together with the secular body and the secular affect, asking the question of how do secular bodies feel and what do secular bodies experience essentially. That is part of it. But also another part of it is the assumption that if we have, that having a human body results in having a universal human experience, and that is exactly not the case, because this is what affect theories are doing right now, and Tanya Lurman kind of building that bridge from cognitive and affective. They say, no, wait a second, different, and there's a term of historied body, so a body with a different history essentially will shape a different experience. So it's not just the wiring, the physicality, there is something of that nature, nurture, and mind and culture that coming together produce actually drastically different experiences. And no one has really looked into that or accounted for that, because it's messy and it's difficult to work with culture, but I think trying to at least work out what Tanya Lurman does, these right now 6 different theories of mind. We're not obviously saying there are just 6 or whatever, but 6 that we can identify and work with. That's perhaps a step in the right direction, which says, no, there is something universal, but there's also something culturally particular, and there is a mechanism for that. So I'm interested in what is the mechanism for that, because that we do not know yet. But obviously, a ton of historical assumptions that also need to be investigated.
Marie, can you say a little bit more how you see the body in relationship to sacred space? Because you've mentioned it, but can you just help us a little bit to see that a little bit more clearly?
I think, again, the way we talk, at least in religious studies, with all of the battles over the term religion, and I didn't have time to go into that deeper, but kind of alluded at not defining non-religion. It is viewed either, the 2 main blocks of definitions are either talking about religion, kind of Taylorian definition, which is all about belief, and then all of that migrates into cognitive approaches to religion, and we talk about, again, belief and agency. Or it is very Durkheimian, which is very social, and religion is this collective effervescence, essentially, that emerges in this kind of collective space, right? No one has ever really connected the 2 on the theoretical level either. On the theoretical level, it's still these battles that are happening in the religious studies field. At least I'm not aware of. If that has happened, I would really love to know, because that will change the direction of my thesis. But that space is kind of one space, and then on top of it now, trying to incorporate science into it makes it even more messy, because the definitions haven't been worked out. So when I talk about our bodies being sacred spaces, I think it is the body that is standing in between those definitional battles, because if we have the mind and we have the society, what is lacking is the body. As the embodiment of both, is the holding space for both. And that's where the framework that, again, I haven't talked about because of just lack of time, I am working out the schema through 4E cognition, which is a new approach to cognitive science. So it's 4E is that cognition is inbrained, so it's not just, kind of mental, it's physical. Inbrained, embodied, so the brain is also part of the body, and all these physical processes and chemistry and hormones and all of that is participating in religious experience. It is embedded between us as people, so its cognition is, again, also social cognition. It's happening as we're talking right now. That is cognition as well. But also it is encultured, and that is the most interesting part, is, again, our bodies are parts of networks with other bodies, which are parts of historical networks, which are also affecting us. And so, sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but that's where the sacred space for me is the body, because it's the only thing that holds all this together. And that's where that migration, it can happen all over the place, but the body will still be there, right? Whether we detect agency or we don't detect agency is not a question, because our bodies still feel, and they will feel different aspects of it historically, but they still feel. And that's where secularism for me is a religious thing. It's still, despite the fact that there are no agents involved.
That's very helpful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And our final speaker for the panel is Dr. Alex Vanderhaven. He's a senior research fellow at JUTACT. That is Jewish Translation and Cultural Transfer in Early Modern Europe. And before that, he's also been working recently on early modern Jewish translations of non-Jewish texts. He's also a research fellow here at the Center for the Study of Conversion. And his recent publications concern conversion to Judaism in early modern Dutch Republic, Sarah the Ashkenazi, wife of the 17th century Messiah Shabtai Tzvi, and the religious experiments of the late 19th century German judge Daniel Paul Schreber. His current paper should be interesting for us in view of our upcoming trip to Jerusalem.
Yep.
We should be aware of this.
Yep.
The Madness of Sacred Space, Critical Reflections on the Jerusalem Syndrome.
Thank you. I will start with an apology first. Because any lecture on the Jerusalem Syndrome should contain naked people running down the streets of Jerusalem, Messiah herself, or a soap while explaining they descend from King David because they're of Cherokee descent, or were born in Delft where the founder of the Netherlands was shot and therefore he's the descendant of King David. So I have lots of good stories from doing field work, but I felt I had to be responsible and deal with some very troubling issues of ways of how others have been dealing with the relationship between mental health, space, and religion. So, apologies. If you have questions afterwards, if you need stories, I'll be available. The psychiatric hospitalization of foreigners with religious behavior in Israel has led to the birth of the term Jerusalem Syndrome. The term is used to represent a pathological phenomenon in which the combination of a visit to Israel, in particular Jerusalem, and religious, in particular Christian, expectations prior to arrival either triggers or worsens a mental illness. However, it is my claim that the aggravation of mental pathology is not the determining characteristic of the Jerusalem Syndrome, nor do religious expectations combined with an actual visit pose a risk to the mental health of foreign visitors. I base this claim on a critical reconsideration of psychiatric data used for previous analyses and on fieldwork in Jerusalem outside the psychiatric hospital's walls. The lecture today will focus on the first, namely on engaging with the two existing theories of the Jerusalem. And I heard recently that I'm the third theory. I've become like the holder of the third theory on the Jerusalem Syndrome. Although my fieldwork is necessary to buttress my criticism of these existing theories, I will not discuss it here. I will, however, before I will start cruelly chafing away from the psychiatric theories of the syndrome, offer you here my alternative definition based on the combination of my rereading of the psychiatric data and my fieldwork, namely that the Jerusalem Syndrome is an eschatological, and you have to see footnotes to every word I'm using here, an eschatological religious subculture of Jewish and Christian foreigners who, on the basis of religious experiences, are convinced that they personally have been called to Israel. Because of the religious topography of the Jewish and Christian scriptures, they attribute central religious significance to Israel as the Holy Land, and in particular to the city of Jerusalem. Part of and participating in this subculture are a number of foreigners who clearly, at least from a non-eschatological outsider, display signs of mental pathology. They are crazy, in other words. However, rather than the beginning or worsening of mental illnesses, as the other theories characterize it, the Jerusalem Syndrome is the site where religious expressions of mentally ill persons interact with similar religious behavior of others to the extent that distinguishing between mental illness and normalcy becomes difficult and, for the political and religious context in which these people operate, irrelevant. So I will now discuss the psychiatric theories of the Jerusalem Syndrome. Although all the reports exist of religiously eccentric travelers in Israel, Marjorie Kemper for the medievalists, for instance, the first connection that was made between mental health and Israel was a positive one. In 1931, Chaim Herman, psychiatrist in Jerusalem's Ezrat Nashim Hospital, claimed to have observed that, quote, the special feeling of freedom of the Jews living in Palestine, unquote, brought about a quickened cure among mentally ill Jewish immigrants. This claim was, however, not uncontested. For instance, novelist Chaim Brenner's mentally ill protagonist in his 1920 Breakdown and Bereavement, so he contested the claim 10 years before it was made, which is wonderful, suffers from a breakdown for the opposite reason, namely the discrepancy between the optimistic tone of Zionist ideology and the harsh living conditions in the Jewish issue. 3 decades after the foundation of the State of Israel, the tourist, in particular the Christian tourist, became the new locus of discourses linking mental illness to the place Israel. This was institutionalized in 1979 with the decision to refer all tourists suffering from mental illness to the psychiatric institution Kfar Shaul in Jerusalem. Soon, the name Jerusalem Syndrome was coined by a group of psychiatrists in Jerusalem, among which most prominent are Yaari, Moshe Kalian, and Elizabeth Stu. They claim to have observed a remarkably high frequency of religious claims made by hospitalized tourists and began to collect data from Kfar Shaul. They developed 2 theories about these hospitalizations that suggest a connection between the tourist's mental pathology and their presence in Jerusalem. The first theory is reminiscent of the critical connotations of madness in the Yeshuv that, for instance, Brenner made, where personal redemption is unsuccessfully sought in a geographical solution and the subject disintegrates at the destination. So you're all in danger if you follow this theory. It considers mental pathology as the cause of travel to Israel and places hospitalizations of foreigners in the context of existential tourism, a term borrowed from Eric Cohen that entails, quote, travel to an elective spiritual center and that is analogous to pilgrimage, unquote. Comparing the Jerusalem Syndrome to tourist hospitalizations in places such as Rome or non-religious sites of symbolical significance such as Florence, the White House, patent offices, airports, it is seen as a, quote, an aggravation of a chronic mental illness, unquote. After the geographical solution to personal problems turned out to be unsuccessful. Israel, in particular Jerusalem, serves as the dramatic stage for these private illnesses that take the shape of a pilgrimage. In the other interpretation that these authors proposed, the central aspect of the Jerusalem Syndrome does not lie in the worsening of a mental illness, but in the pathological reaction of often quite healthy religious tourists to their arrival in Israel. Thus, Kalian explained the impact of travel to Jerusalem in a 1995 Time magazine interview. I quote, "The thrill of a place previously only known as a sublime dream is in the case of the Jerusalem Syndrome followed by a disappointment that it is also just an earthly town. Unwilling to accept this, the victims withdraw from this reality." So basically they cannot cope with the fact that Jerusalem isn't what they expect it to be. Kalian and Whitstone eventually abandoned this view of Jerusalem Syndrome as a pathogenic, the city of Jerusalem as a pathogenic factor, and restricted their argument to the first explanation by pointing out that the data suggests that mental illnesses always started before the arrival in Israel. Besides describing the Jerusalem Syndrome as a worsening of mental illness or the result of cognitive dissonance, they also associated it with Christianity. Many journalists who visited the offices of Jerusalem psychiatrists, and even I went there, and the psychiatrist did not believe I was not a journalist. No, I'm just doing research. No, you're a journalist, I know. It made me doubt his mental health.
They're mad too.
Yeah, no, this specific person, I will not mention names, he was, I think, very crazy. So these tourists went to these offices and they informed their audiences worldwide, and you can still see it if you see like reports now, that the Jerusalem Syndrome, in the words of one news article, quote, affects Christian pilgrims, but is occasionally diagnosed on Jews who tour holy sites. Yeah, so it's mainly a Christian phenomenon and occasionally also a Jew goes crazy. The theory of cognitive dissonance has even evolved into the explicit identification of tours' mental breakdowns with Protestant Christianity. Thus, in a 2000 article in the British Medical Journal, which apparently publishes these things, Bar-El and others argued that pious Protestants comprise 95% of what they denominate as the pure Jerusalem Syndrome, namely a breakdown when there are no pre-existing mental illnesses present. The reason they claimed is that very religious Protestants have a greater attachment than tourists of other religions to, quote, an idealistic subconscious image of Jerusalem, unquote. All of these analyses are premised on specific ideological expectations of the effect of the land of Israel. So basically my lecture is about how crazy these interpretations are, not how crazy the people who suffer from the Jerusalem syndrome are, as you might notice. So all these analyses are premised on specific ideological expectations of the effect of the land of Israel on the mental health of those who arrive. So HERSHKOVITS, the psychiatrist from the 30s, saw his patients as exiles who came home, and therefore arriving here was mentally was beneficial to them. Brenner, on the other hand, described his character as one who has fallen for a fictitious hope based on his belief and experience maybe that immigration is potentially dangerous for Jews' mental stability. In the two more recent theories, the subjects of interest are classified as tourists, especially as Christian theorists, who fill their own category that is commonly characterized as uncommitted to the destination of travel, namely as, and I'm quoting some specialists on tourism, quote, engaged in a ritually failing quest for authenticity. This is a definition from Dean McCannell, the tourist. Or, quote, encouraged to look at different viewpoints rather than imposing a singular sacred reality on the visited site. This is a citation from John Yaari on Zooming Places. Since the beliefs and behaviors typical of the Jerusalem syndrome stand in stark contrast to this disengaged attitude toward a travel destination, labeling these foreigners as tourists turns them into tourists gone astray. However, this is not how these people regard themselves. Of all the hospitalized foreigners in 1986 and 1987, so the psychiatric data are from specific periods, and it's a point I wrote and corresponded with the psychiatrist, like, do you have those still? Like, we lost them, we moved, and this boxes. I felt there was some kind of embarrassing situation going on that they didn't deal responsibly with the data. So, in this data, almost half of the tourists, quote, came for reasons of a mystical religious nature, or to try out a different lifestyle, possibly resulting in staying in Jerusalem. In the absence of more appropriate classifications, like so, there's no visas for prophets or messiah, so these people were forced to use a tourist messiah, a tourist visa, so they became pathological tourists. This latter category of pathological arrivals differs from Herman's immigrants not only by their tourist status, but also by religion, and therefore is presented as more vulnerable to a mental breakdown. The problem, however, is that the suggestion of the Jerusalem syndrome as a predominantly Christian phenomenon is unfounded. Although the literature on the Jerusalem syndrome is almost exclusively presents Christian cases, more than half of the hospitalized foreigners are Jewish, and this misrepresentation receives in none of the publications any justification. Moreover, the veracity of Bar-El's statistical election of the Protestant sufferer was challenged by Kalyan and Wisdom, who had access to the same data and did not see any reason to draw the same conclusion. So the notion of the pure Jerusalem syndrome seems to be truly an invention by Bar-El. In addition, Bar-El's essentialization of a Protestant unconscious suggests there is good reason. In addition, the fact that many hospitalized tourists are Christians can simply be explained by matching the hospital data with tourist data from those years, which reveal that if any conclusion should be drawn, which you shouldn't, because this is statistically, I've talked to professional statisticians, you cannot draw conclusions, but we're not. So if we can draw conclusions, Jews are more crazy than Christians in the story of the Jerusalem syndrome. Because there were simply many more Christian tourists in this period than there were Jewish tourists. But statistically, this is not a valid conclusion. It seems therefore that the stereotype of the Christian as sufferer of the Jerusalem syndrome is the result of an exact inversion of the positive effect Herman believed Zion had on immigrant Jews. The mental health of the mentally ill who arrive and expect a Jewish land undergoes a dramatic improvement. Whereas healthy minds that arrive at expectations of a landscape reflecting Christian ideas are green meadows, sheep, shepherds, one of them maybe a Messiah, are in danger of a mental breakdown. In the theory of a mental breakdown, the foreigner is upon arrival subject to a swift judgment of madness, lest he or she accepts the correct religious and territorial map of Israel. The notion of a mental breakdown upon filled expectations itself rests on shaky foundations. The combination of the detailed description of the successive 7 stages of this mental breakdown in an article co-authored by Barrel in 2000 and the fact that tourists are hospitalized only after their breakdown does not inspire great confidence in the accuracy of this analysis. Moreover, the naivete of the notion is illustrated by studies that describe religious mechanisms, and you don't even need studies for this, that describe religious mechanisms that successfully deal with this dissonance, such as Leon Verstegen's famous work on the failed prophecies of the UFO cult. In addition, my fieldwork shows that the eschatological travelers' ability to cope quite well, they are very well able to cope with a world that doesn't comply to their hopes towards the place. In fact, contrasting ideal and reality is a specialty of eschatology. So this whole notion is you expect certain things and you arrive and they're not like this. If you are a religious eschatologist, this is how you operate. Yeah? You don't arrive in a redeemed Israel, you arrive in an Israel that should be unredeemed. Looking beyond the hospitals, and I'm concluding with this, the fact that these understandings of the Jerusalem syndrome are based on tourist hospitalizations has given rise to 2 ways in which the picture presented of the syndrome is skewed. First, because the analyses are based on hospitalized tourists only, it is automatically assumed that psychiatric hospitalization is part and parcel of the Jerusalem syndrome. Even though no statistical data exist about the Jerusalem syndrome besides those from Par Shaul, a critical look at the existing data can offer some cautious suggestions. If it is true that the country attracts pathological travelers with religious fantasies and that Israel poses a danger to the mental health of religious, especially Christian tourists, one would expect high hospitalization rates among foreigners in Israel. Yet, between 1979 and 1987, 100 foreigners underwent psychiatric hospitalization every year, less than half of whom can be identified with the Jerusalem syndrome, while the yearly tourist population was on average more than 1 million during this period. This confirms Kaplan and Whitsam's later argument that psychiatric hospitalization on the basis of religious beliefs related to Jerusalem is actually a very rare phenomenon. Second, and here becomes actually very interesting, data from Par Shaul show that the mentally ill with religious delusions, because those who are part of the Jerusalem syndrome, are less quickly hospitalized than other mentally ill persons. Whereas 90% of the not observant, and I was so happy finally to find a Jewish category instead of like the typical like Protestant categories based on belief. Here, like the non-religious tourists are like the not observant tourists. Yeah, so it's really interesting because we're talking mostly about Christians, so not observant Christians and observant Christians. So 90% of the not observant Christian tourists were hospitalized within 2 weeks of their arrival, whereas more than half of the religious group remained outside of the asylum walls until that period. So if you were religious, it took longer time for you to be hospitalized. This has been explained by giving religion the dubious honor of being both the cause and stabilization of the patient's illness. When we, however, extend the demographic beyond the hospital population, and we make the reasonable assumption, and I can confirm this by my fieldwork, that religious beliefs are not only related to postponing hospitalizations temporarily, but also in other cases postponing it indefinitely. So a very different explanation becomes possible. The religious beliefs and behaviors typical of the Jerusalem syndrome actually function to prevent mentally ill persons from being hospitalized. Thus, if those who are hospitalized were referred significantly later than other tourists, they might only be the tip of an iceberg. So watch out when you're walking inside the old city walls. Thus, instead of a pathological phenomenon, the Jerusalem syndrome should be seen as, and I'm basing this on my fieldwork, an eschatological subculture consisting of foreigners who believe that they're called by God to come to Jerusalem. and in which symptoms of mental illness and religious behavior coexist peacefully. Whereas from the academic psychiatric viewpoint, the phenomenon is regarded as pathological, on the ground it is actually a religious subculture. And this is of significance for wider arguments about mental illness and Western culture. So returning to the end of the last question, last lecture. When comparing the ecstatic experiences of Sri Lankan ascetics to those that are regarded as psychosis in the West, the anthropologist Gananath Obeyesekere, echoing Foucault's famous argument about the silencing of madness in the West, concluded that, quote, psychotic fantasy in the West, we're talking about the West, psychotic fantasy is a private, incommunicable set of images. The afflicted person is trying to represent his inner turmoil in outer images, but the images constructed have little communicative function except to express to the culture the idea that the patient is sick, unquote. The case of the Jerusalem syndrome, here I presented to you, contradicts Foucault and Obeyesekere, because it shows that there are sites in Western culture where expressions of mental illness can become meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Are there questions?
Stay here.
Yeah, either way.
I'm looking. I'm also a member. Do I need the mic?
The mic here is switched on.
So Miriam, how does this work? Okay, I'm Miriam Looking, a member
You're good.
of the Center of the Study of Conversion also, and I think all of us would be interested in hearing an example from your fieldwork maybe, and also if you have a comparative data about the Rome syndrome or other destinations, like other pilgrimage destinations.
I'll go first to the second while I think of the best example to give us this many. There are a number of studies. There's the Rome syndrome, there's the Paris syndrome, and I've been catching up on the syndrome literature, but I usually start to pop up the Florence syndrome. So there's a number of places where tourists break down, and then there's a bunch of psychiatrists who come up with an argument that it's related to the place and how tourists are not able to cope with the present. For instance, the Paris syndrome is Asian tourists who go crazy in Paris, and most of those researchers, like the present one on the Jerusalem syndrome, are usually on shaky foundations. Examples of the Jerusalem syndrome. So I spent a year talking to crazy people, which is also really interesting, but one of the things you find out is that the distinction between crazy and not crazy is not that clear. So I remember, like, for instance, like in the beginning, walking in the middle of the night near the Western Wall, and people kind of walking around and behaving weirdly, but then, you know, you're religious, so it's not really, it was hard to distinguish crazy from not, but my favorite was actually the Dutch Messiah. So he was clearly, so I found people who were clearly mentally ill, so he was hearing voices, he had very strange stories, how he came from Davidic descent, he was sending faxes to his publisher with cartoons of Garfield. He was clearly crazy. At the same time, people interacted with him didn't always treat him like crazy. There was one time I was talking to him, and a Danish Orthodox Jew who was also staying in his Christian hostel. Everything is fishy about this. I don't know why he was an Orthodox Jew and saying in the Christian, but he came to me and started shouting at him, "You're not a real prophet." So I wasn't shouting at him like, "You're crazy, but you're not a real prophet." And other people I met actually were in interaction with other people as well. So like prophets found each other on the Mount of Olives. There was a group of people who kind of found each other in Jerusalem. They kind of drifted in with their own strange stories, and they found each other, and they came up with a community. They were kicked out at some point because the Shabak thought they were going to kill themselves collectively, so they were arrested and they were ejected from the country. But yeah, so I have a million stories of cases. You might meet them.
I was wondering while you were talking, since this is a modern recorded phenomenon, and you were relating to stuff that starts popping up in the 20s, maybe the 30s. I mean, if we're talking about Brenner and later on Herman, because this is a modern related phenomena, is there any record from the British Mandate period done by British psychiatrists? Number one, number two. Jerusalem for 19 years is a split city, and you have pilgrims coming to both sides of this political divide. Do you have similar phenomena on the Jordanian side of Jerusalem or is there any record at all of people of this kind of nature, people who are, as you said, Christian, usually Protestant, at least following, the guidelines?
I'm actually contesting.
Yeah, I realize that, but is there any data that may either prove or disprove your assumptions?
So this is the interesting. First of all, there are a number of 19th century cases of people who are mocked by others as being crazy. There's also, like I mentioned, Marjorie Kemper. There's also a case of the Middle Ages that it's always hard to pathologize the past, but she seems to have she wasn't the most normal person. But yeah, the whole point is like strange behavior and madness come together here. Regarding other types of people, one of the things I found out in my research, so I very quickly suspected the assessment of Christians as more crazy than Jews to be founded in what I describe as a certain bias. So if you're Jewish, you become more normal. If you're crazy, you don't belong here, so you become more crazy. I suspected it not to be true. However, when I started to ask around, me knocking on doors, do you have any crazy people? And people feel this is a very contested and ideological issue. So if I talk to Jewish hostels and Jewish institutions, religious institutions, we don't have such people. Because it's something that's the same with Muslims. Yeah, I'm sure. For instance, in the last Intifada of the knives, there were a number of people who were suffering from mental illnesses, and it takes shape of becoming like a jihadist. Yeah, so I'm sure that, but these data, they're embarrassing. So once you start to mix religion, pilgrimage, and mental illness, you need, in a sense, the situation in which Christian tourists were in Israel. In a sense, ideologically, it pays off for Israel to say that the Christians are crazy. And otherwise, I'm sure, for instance, in Mecca, lots of things happening, but it will probably never come out because it's problematic. Yeah, so one of the things of my research is that I feel that in the end I ran into people who, I even had a friend who had a brain tumor, so he visited me in Amsterdam, he started to escape because his plane to Israel was waiting for him because he had to be in Jerusalem. So it happens when people have mental illnesses, they become mentally ill, but it's very contested. So it's really, I actually intended to write my dissertation on the topic, and I just started to realize, I will get into deep trouble in even getting people to sign, okay, you just told me your life story, why you are the Messiah, can you sign this so I can, they will not do it. So I knew I would get into trouble getting access to the right kind of people.
I wonder if you may be saying this, that rather than to say is it a pathology or a religious subculture, well, the idea is that certain religious subcultures simply have a greater, at least when they're on pilgrimage, have a greater tolerance for deviant behavior. And I've seen this in groups, Protestant groups that I've guided, where someone seems to be a bit off for the day or acting strangely, and then to make that a cause of division is sort of antithetical to the spirit of pilgrimage. So that the group will hug them, or the group will contain them in ways that perhaps tourists, I would imagine that the number of pilgrims who come in, number of Christians who come in organized and tightly bound groups is probably certainly greater than the average tourist and probably greater than the number of Jews. so that that mechanism that protects and keeps them away from Kfar Shaul, right, will be stronger.
Yeah. Yeah, first of all, like, people only get hospitalized if they become violent. So if you're stably, I think stably genius, but that's somebody else who's crazy. Nobody understands my Trump joke. I'm a stable genius. So if you're stably crazy, then nothing will happen. To refer to your first part of your question, there's two elements in this subculture that are very welcoming to extreme experiences that are characterized by mental illness. The first is this notion of eschatology. So the present situation of the world is one of a state of sin, of suffering, of being bad. And at some point in the near future, and it's next weekend, this was interesting. I did my fieldwork in 2000, and all the journalists were like, now it's going to be, you know, massive suicides. And I was like, no, it will be 31st of December 1999, and then it will be the week after. So the few hours after midnight, the Mount of Olives was filled with journalists with cameras, and nobody was committing mass suicide. So this eschatological element is there. And another element that I think you're hinting at is also this sense of communitas, which is temporarily, like Victor Turner really is useful here, that people go on a trip for a while, they are far more tolerant for strange experience that they would never tolerate at home. So for instance, there was a very impressive prophet from New Zealand in one of the hostels outside of Damascus Gate. And he was holding court in the basement, healing people, and he had like, on the one hand, there was a crazy story, on the other hand, it was Guido will probably tell some of those stories, like a born-again Christian story, but he was healing people, other people were coming in and were also prophets, and things were, and I was thinking maybe in another context he wouldn't have been flourishing as well. So the eschatological part and the part that many tourists, because these people often are like in the tourist scene, they come temporarily, and for them this is something that's a specific phase, a specific period in which they are far more tolerant to these kinds of behaviors and beliefs. But you probably have your own stories as well to tell from people you encountered in the old city.
Are there any other questions? Great, thank you. Now we'll hear from our respondent, Dr. KEREN, ABBOU, HERSHKOVITS.
Thank you, ERIKA, and thank you for 3 great lectures. It was a real pleasure to listen and to think about them. Unfortunately, while being so excited and writing my notes, I'm not so sure I remember to which person each of my notes is related. But I think that I'm not even sure what order my notes are. All 3 lectures refer to a triangle of body, mind, and interpretation, and this interpretation is also interpreted because it's not really clear who is the agency that creates this interpretation, whether it's the person himself or surrounding or maybe professionals. So I wanted to look at 2 things, 2 examples from a different sphere, actually 3. That might help you also think of your own research in maybe a different perspective. One is a personal encounter. A few years ago, I met somebody who just had a baby, so I congratulated him and we exchanged birth stories. And and I didn't see him for a while. Well, I was just a mother for a 3-year-old, and I remember exactly how early infancy was. So I thought, well, he's taking some time off because he's tired. And a while later, I met him, and I asked, so how was your paternity leave? And he said, it was great. We went to Mecca. he actually took his newborn child to visit Mecca for pilgrimage. So I asked him, oh, you're doing this now, so she's doing her pilgrimage? And he said, no, I'm taking her there. I took her there because I wanted the spirituality of the place to direct her in her future life. So this will be something that will take her through life in the correct path. So this is one way of directing the child. And this, I think that this is something very interesting, because you look at pilgrimage in different ways, and the influence it might be is also something that is in a part of interpretation. You can look at it in different ways. Another thing I wanted to consider is the crazy aspect. Sorry for taking your words. There is, are you familiar with Sufism? Good. So for those of you who are not familiar, Sufism is a mystical Islam. And there are different brotherhoods. One very interesting brotherhood is in Kurdistan. And they have ceremonies that are in a way very similar to what you would find in other places. But if you look at it without really knowing what is the intention of what they're doing, you might find it maybe crazy, maybe even something else. The ceremony, the dhikr, starts by making noises, making rhythmic noises. All the men have long hair and it's bound in a way, and then they start bowing their head along with the noises they're making, until the hair falls out from the knot and it's all around them. And this is the time where magic, or craziness, or something else happens, because this is the time where the person is actually doing what he intended to do, and this is to worship God and taking a mystical or spiritual journey towards God. So we can't walk to God, but we can take a spiritual journey towards God. And the way they do that is by allowing their body to disappear. So how would you know that your body has disappeared? You still see it, you still feel it. This is where interpretation goes in, because they take nails, swords, knives, and they stick it to themselves or cut themselves. And for the advanced ones, they also hammer swords in their heads. Now, nobody is hurt. When I show it to students, they're shocked, because it looks shocking. And this is where our interpretation, like what you were talking about, Alex, our interpretation is that this is self-mutilation. We're doing something that we shouldn't do. Our body is a temple. Was also something that came up in the lectures. But this is, they're not hurting themselves. They're actually letting go of their body. They're not hurt. They're not hospitalized afterwards. They're not doing anything that really harms them. The exact opposite. They are climbing the spiritual stairs towards God. So I think that all three lectures were looking at this interaction between body, mind, and the different ways to interpret it, and use different tools. So the tools part is also another thing that I want to look at. We're at the end of Ramadan. The month of fasting is decided by moon sighting. So in Judaism, we also go by the moon. The month is decided by the moon, but there are calendars that are calculated, and this goes back to the 4th century in modern day Islam, they don't use calculations, they use citing. Now there are different reasons for that, and one of them is the mind part. According to the fitla tradition, a person is born with whatever is needed to become a Muslim. He doesn't need anything else but the faculties and abilities and knowledge he's born with. What does it mean? It means that it doesn't even need to be actually taught or educated in it. It is a natural disposition for him. So how does he become a Jew, a Christian, or a nun? By education, by his parents telling him what to do. And this is how they break the natural frame of his or her existence. So how does it work with Ramadan? The citing should be done with the eye, because there's no need in calculations. A baby does not know how to calculate, but he can see. But that also creates some problems, because, and that, again, I think it was one of your comments, if you know that you should see the moon because it's coming, you become predisposed to seeing it. So that creates a problem, because people might make mistakes. People are so anxious to see that they might see the wrong thing. They might not see the actual moon, and that might lead to mistakes, which actually happened sometime in the early 80s, where 3 days of the month were disappeared because somebody made a mistake. So now we need some tools to correct that. What kind of tools? That's also a question of interpretation and consideration. So, thank you.
We still have some time. Does any of you want to respond?
I have two short comments. You were describing the journey to Mecca as towards the sacred center, and in my cases, you often see much stronger a denial of the sacred center. So the sacred center is fallen and should be redeemed, usually by the person who arrives there, who also needs some personal redemption. So that's interesting. The sacred center can give, but it can also be in need of. Another example of the Sufis was really interesting, because crazy behavior from the outside that we think is crazy behavior can be one, behavior that we just don't understand, but it makes sense completely in its cultural context. And second, in all religions of the world, the religious traditions of the world, you have behavior which is transgressive because it's for instance like belonging to the redeemed messianic era in which all previous laws are abandoned. So for instance, chapter 3, the Jewish Messiah on purpose transgressed all things. And it can also, you have it a lot in Asian religions also, it can be serving as a certain breakthrough, like in Tibetan Buddhism, you have in Zen, you have in Taoism, so like crazy behavior, some kind of like somehow shaking loose that which need to be shaken loose to get to the other side. So those are like
they are the ones that you saints.
Yes, yeah, saints or madmen. It depends on
reception.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to basically ask for comment, like when you mentioned in Sufism that aspect of ecstatic experience, but you said it's the body disappears. And I was just wondering, does the body actually disappear, or is it the aspect of participation, which participation is such a big, thing in Abrahamic religions and Eastern religions as well? And is it more, not so much it disappears, but it participates to the extent that it's that connection that becomes part of it? Like what I don't know that.
The aim of the Vika, or the aim of the Sufi, is to become one with God. So you have to lose all your human aspects. You're not supposed to be hungry, tired, and you do different rituals that allow you to disregard these human aspects. So the body is there, but in your inner feeling, you're not supposed to feel anything else but love of God and knowledge of God.
So we could look at it as participation and linkage and connection rather than a positive language rather than negative.
I just want to ask you a question following your presentation. I was mentioning this to Anna as you got off the podium. You were talking about a way of rethinking the relationships between belief and non-belief. And I was wondering where, for instance, a concept like conversion fits into this paradigm. Because, I mean, we are studying conversion, we've been studying conversion for a while. A lot of the people around the table here have been studying conversion. But they have been studying conversion from one belief to another, either as a part of a group, mass conversion, or personal transformation. ERIKA has been discussing, people who've undergone forced conversion. What role does conversion play within the paradigm that you're trying, or the paradigm shift that you're trying to kind of put your finger on?
Well, that's such a good question. I love it. I think if I can frame my answer between the two poles. So as you were saying what you were saying, I immediately thought of the two poles. One would be Brian Mumford, the book called Christian Atheist, and he was the rector, if I'm not mistaken, of the University Church in Oxford, Anglican priest, but atheist. How does that work? The other side of the spectrum is Sam Harris, one of the four horsemen of new atheism in the UK, who wrote this entire book, Waking Up, on his profound spiritual experiences, where he sort of like tried to follow, some of the atheists of the past and took whatever he took, some sort of drugs and all the spiritual reality that opened up to him, and now he's trying to reconcile his atheism with that as well. And I find that in that space of spiritual but non-religious that I'm looking at, this is becoming more and more of like these other poles where we're talking about, like, it's hard to talk about conversion because I think those clearly defined, if I'm talking about conversion into the non-religion, like that is the language of modernity, and I don't know, of course, even like circling things at me for that statement, but I think modernity is not ruling that conversation anymore, and so just even kind of the measuring the social temperature, talking to atheists in the UK, it's just people immediately like, but I'm not the Richard Dawkins kind. There's this always this thing, but I'm not, So it's that interesting textured space that we need to find language for and vocabulary for because it doesn't exist.
So
I think
enhanced spirituality on the one hand, but kind of
staying
away from very
definitions, which is very
fluid
postmodern.
definitions.
Yeah, very postmodern, and kind of not even postmodern. I would say metamodern. It's kind of like all this metamodern manifesto from a couple of years ago that describes that space where we can be, and that rejection of binaries across. We're just talking about religion right now. We're talking about gender. We're talking about so many different things where binaries are just abandoned. And so how are we to sort of conceptualize that space? That's interesting.
Any other questions?
Coffee break.
Coffee break until 4 o'clock?
4 o'clock. Yeah. Super. Thank you very much.